Hello, I'm Sonya Friedman. My subject today, repressed memory. The first issue is whether a traumatic event like childhood sex abuse can be forgotten, pushed to the back of consciousness, and then remembered in adulthood. CNN's special assignment examines repressed memory in a report today and raises an even more troubling issue. There are growing concerns that some therapists encourage their patients to recall sexual abuse that never occurred. And with me now in Washington, CNN correspondent Kathy Slobogan. Kathy, as you talked to the experts, did they feel it was possible for a therapist to introduce this kind of thought to a client?
Yes, it divides the therapeutic community, but there's definitely a large number of therapists, from psychiatrists on down, who fear that some therapists are inducing memories in their patients.
And having said that, would there be any possible motivation that we might consider?
Well, it's difficult to generalize about people's motivation. Certainly there are some people out there that are trying to make money off of their patients and are using this as a hook. I think probably the vast majority of therapists who do this kind of thing, though, are well-intentioned and possibly just overzealous. They really believe that there's sex abuse everywhere.
But Kathy, it seems so difficult to believe that someone could take a beloved child, introduce this kind of a thought, and then allow a therapist to lead you down a path of turning on a parent whom you've known for 30 years for a stranger that you may have known for 2 45-minute sessions.
It does seem difficult to believe, but if you talk to the retractors, women who call themselves retractors, these are women who've been through this experience, have now come out on the other end, and feel that they were misled and induced by their therapist and that they had memories which were false. You talk to these women and they tell you that they thought this would heal them, that the therapist pressured them, that they were very vulnerable, that they were trying to please the therapist, and that they thought that if they would just come up with these memories, which their therapists were so interested in getting them to have, that their problems would be solved.
And indeed, is there a process that you've been able to discover the therapists typically use?
Pardon me?
Is there a process that the therapists typically use in the therapy?
There are a number of techniques that are typically used. Hypnosis is often used. The therapist often suggests that the patients read books like Repressed Memory or Courage to Heal, which describe techniques for getting at these memories. Over and over again, you hear the same stories. You read the books, do the things that are in the books, imagine abuse, hypnosis. These are the kind of techniques that are often used.
And is this something that is directly suggested? Is it implied?
Again, it's difficult to generalize. I've heard stories from patients who've said that the therapist in one session said, "You have all the symptoms, you've been sexually abused." And when the patient would say, "Wait a minute, that doesn't sound like me, I wasn't abused," they'd say, "You're in denial." I mean, in those cases, the pressure is very hard sell. I think there are other cases where it can take months and months for it to come out, where the sell is not as hard. So it's difficult to generalize.
Now, we can see a little bit of what happens in a segment of this kind of therapy with a producer that you actually went undercover with.
Yes, because of the large number of families that we feel have been torn apart through this process, and because it's so difficult to know what goes on inside the privacy of a therapist's office, we decided to go into therapy undercover. Now, before taking that step, we consulted with a psychologist who has extensive expertise in this area, and we asked him to help us come up with symptoms for our undercover producer, which would not necessarily point to child abuse. Our producer took a hidden camera to see this therapist. She said she'd been depressed, that it had affected her marriage and lessened her interest in sex. At no time did she say she'd been sexually abused. At the end of the very first session, the therapist suggested a diagnosis.
It seems to me that you have the symptoms of someone who could have experienced some sexual trauma.
Our producer never suggested she had been sexually abused and said she had no memory of it.
Do you get many women like this?
Many.
And they forget?
Yes. They forget. They have no idea. In fact, I mean, what you've presented to me, Leanne, is so classic that I'm just sitting here blown away, actually.
The therapist then told our producer to read a book about repressed memories.
It didn't seem like me.
In a second session, our producer expressed strong doubts about the possibility of abuse. The therapist didn't force it, but she went on to describe how repressed memory works.
I mean, if something bad happened to you, I would think that you'd remember it.
You're right. You're right. If something bad happens, you really remember it. But if something too bad happens to you, so bad that you can't cope with it, you forget it.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, I think in a courtroom, one might suggest it is leading the witness. Did you meet with any of the parents or hear about what the parents' answer was to the accusation?
Yes, the reason we picked this particular therapist was that we knew of at least 6 people who had gone to her for other reasons and came out accusing their parents of sexual abuse. So we picked someone who had a pattern of this. And we talked to a number of the parents of these older children. They're, of course, devastated. They say it never happened. They say that it was induced by the therapist, and they say that their families have been torn apart by this process. None of the families wanted to go on camera because they have this hope that someday they'll be able to reconcile with their children, and they were afraid that going on camera would ruin that possibility.
Now, Kathy, what is someone to do? On the one hand, we have the false memory syndrome support group. We have women who have come out that you have spoken to who said, I was led and went along with this because I wanted to please the therapist. And then you have parents who are hoping. Is that all they can do? Hope if they say that they're innocent?
Well, it's really hard for them to know what to do. I think the support group, it gives a lot of comfort to these people. Some people feel that as time goes on, natural familial pressures will bring the family back together. Sometimes the grandchildren bring the family back together because, of course, the grandchildren don't understand what's going on and they want so badly to see their grandparents, and that starts a natural healing process. But I have to say that many of the families we've interviewed are still in this kind of standoff situation where the children are insisting the abuse happened, the parents are insisting that it didn't happen, and everybody's miserable.
And indeed, there's no statute of limitations, I believe, in this. That is, if you recall the event, the statute of limitations starts to run from that moment. So we could see cases in court of events that happened 30, 40 plus years ago.
That's true. In fact, 15 states that we know of have already extended their statute of limitations so that people recalling long ago abuse can sue. And there have been some very large awards, in one case $500,000.
Kathy, it's a very, very interesting piece. I thank you for being here with us. I hope that our CNN audience gets a chance to see it in total. But of course, childhood sexual abuse does happen, and that's what's under scrutiny here. But there is something else going on, and that is whether some therapists are actually encouraging individuals to believe in abuse that didn't happen, and then to make false accusations. So when we continue a debate between a leading exponent of repressed memory, Ellen Bass, well known for her book, The Courage to Heal, and psychiatrist David Halperin, who says it's extremely difficult to substantiate memories of abuse that allegedly surfaced long after childhood. I've been talking about repressed memories, the subject today of a CNN special assignment report in which a CNN producer working undercover told a therapist that her marriage was being affected by her depression and a diminished interest in sex. The therapist suggested that she had been sexually abused as a child. Ellen Bass, co-author of The Courage to Heal, is with us. It is the leading book in the repressed memory movement. And Ellen, I welcome you. And how often does this kind of thing happen, do you think?
Let me start.
Yes.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here, Sonia. Very glad to have the opportunity to respond to some of this. Let me just first say, though, that The Courage to Heal is not really about the repressed memory movement. Dealing with memories, how to process memories, and what our memories mean, and how to integrate them into our healing is just one small part of The Courage to Heal. It's a book about helping survivors face the abuse they've gone through. It's a supportive and respectful and compassionate guide. It's not basically about repressed memories, but the question, how often does it happen that somebody thinks that they were abused and they really weren't? It certainly happens, but it's extremely rare.
How do you define survivor?
Survivor is someone who was sexually abused. Survivor of child sexual abuse is a person who was sexually abused in some way under the age of 18.
Now, you yourself are not a survivor of child sexual abuse. Where did you start to come to the material that you became as involved in this?
I came to this material without actually meaning to. The material came to me. I'm a writer, and I taught creative writing workshops for women. This was in the early 70s, and at that time, child sexual abuse wasn't in the media. There were very few books accessible about it, and very few mental health professionals were able to recognize or respond to clients who came to them with distress from having been abused. Mostly when people came to the mental health profession, they were not believed, they were blamed, or the abuse was minimized. In the context of my writing workshops, women began to write about their experience having been sexually abused as children. I was shocked and appalled that this happened. I didn't know about it. I'd never experienced it myself. I had no expectation of hearing about it. But I was also very impressed with the integrity and honesty and courage of the women who shared their stories.
Now, Ellen, these women shared their stories in a voluntary way, coming forward, feeling that they could trust you and that
exactly.
they could feel comfortable with what had occurred. You found some commonalities among the women. Could you tell us a little bit about the profile, or at least what we would all have to ask ourselves?
There were commonalities, but there were also many differences. Mainly what women shared is that when they were children, and sometimes it was from being a very small child, sometimes it was in adolescence.
As young as what age? As young as 3, as young as 1 year?
I think that it really, in the creative writing workshops, when women shared their stories, it was sometimes as young as being very young children, you know, 2, 3, 4, with abuse that continued on. Right. And of course, one's memory of very early abuse is going to be quite different than a memory from being 10 or 12 or 14. But it really ran the gamut, and it ran the gamut from violent rape to inappropriate sexual touching to being forced to view pornographic films or look at pornographic material, anything, including non-genital abuse.
Now, as you've been talking to some of the women who've been in therapy, how long did it take for them to recover this memory if they did not have it when they went into therapy?
Most of the time when women go into therapy, they do have some memory. It's very unusual for women to go into therapy with no thought that they were sexually abused and to come out of therapy thinking that they were abused, presumably because the therapist suggested this or somehow implanted it.
So what you saw then was different from what it is your understanding actually goes on in the country in terms of the therapist intervening in that kind of direct suggestion.
Actually, what I continue to see is quite different from what's being presented here. What I see is that someone often seeks therapy because they're experiencing intrusive memories, because they're experiencing flashbacks that they don't know how to interpret, because they have a sense of having been sexually abused, perhaps without the specific picture memories or particular facts associated with it. But the scenario that somebody's life has been pretty much fine, they have some adult problems, they go to therapy, poof, there's abuse, is really not a very common scenario.
So let me just ask, if I may, the CNN investigative reports seem to suggest that there may be a number of therapists who are making this suggestion to a vulnerable population looking for a fast answer, perhaps, or a way of targeting something that is contributing to their malaise. What do you think of that?
Absolutely true, but the number is very minuscule. I think on the report when we heard the whole thing, Renee Fredrickson mentioned that there are so many more perpetrators than therapists who implant memories. Certainly, I wouldn't want to defend the entire therapist population, because there are therapists who are not competent and who make a great many mistakes, but it's a very small number compared to the numbers of people who are actually abused as children.
Okay, let's bring in Dr. David Halpern, who's a psychiatrist who's consulted with the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. Do you think that it's just in a very small number of cases?
I have no idea how many it is, but the thing that concerns me is to have any family destroyed in situations which are unjustified, to have people brought up on criminal charges and being convicted, and then facing the rest of their lives in prison. To my mind, is a horrendous result. There were only some 20 or 30 witches burnt or killed at Salem. That is 30 or 20 or whatever the number it is to many, and the thing that to my mind is so important, is that people are being destroyed
But Dr. Halpern,
and their families
let me
are being
ask you this.
destroyed in situations where
Let's
they
say
can
that
never
you and
protect
I
themselves.
were in therapy at some point, and that somebody was asking us a variety of questions instead of having the information come within, and we said, no, that didn't happen. Or we said, let me think about that. And we asked our siblings about that, or other family members. Why are we seeing something that really suggests that these people are robots and don't have a mind of their own? Who's going to give up a wonderful relationship with a parent to turn around and say, you sexually abused me?
Well, I didn't say that these people necessarily had a wonderful relationship with their parent. I think obviously people who come into treatment were troubled. Their relationship with their parent may not have been exemplary, as it were. They may have had some difficulties with their parent, and this is an answer to human difficulty which answers all questions, all problems, and has the added virtue of making you into a victim. And therefore you have no responsibility for it.
Ellen Bass, how do you respond to that?
Oh, thank you for giving me an opportunity to respond to that. The healing process from child sexual abuse is absolutely the opposite of that. It's not about becoming a victim. It's about becoming a survivor. And although you're not responsible for having been sexually abused, you are totally responsible for healing in your life and for changing the problems that you have in your life, for addressing them. Acknowledging that you were abused is just the first step in a long line of steps, and it does not solve your problems. In fact, it gives you a great deal of very hard healing work to do, and people take it on because they've been in enormous distress and because they truly want to create healthy and fulfilling lives for themselves.
However, that assumes that indeed the abuse did occur, and the real issue that we have here is that it may not have occurred, and in point of fact, people, because of this iatrogenic, in other words, counselor. Many of these people, by the way, are not therapists. They're counselors who are in this because it gives them money, power, whatever.
So you're saying there may be another agenda?
Yes, and these people who are troubled are simultaneously being deprived of the love and support that their family could indeed give them.
Let's go to our audience at this moment. There may be some people who have had experience on both sides of this issue. We're talking about repressed memories having to do with childhood sexual abuse. Here's our number, 212-643-0077. Welcome back. Let's go to Arlene in New York as we continue our discussion. Welcome.
Hi.
Yes.
I'd like to tell you that my daughter had a very wonderful relationship with her younger brother and sister and both of us, and she had some trouble in her marriage, and she went to one of these therapists who told her that she has to go back under hypnosis to find out about her childhood, that there seems to be some kind of trauma that she's buried. And then she convinced her that she was molested by her mother and that her father had raped her and that the family were in denial. We tried to meet with the therapist who would not speak with us or have anything to do with us. She told us that we were molesters and we were in denial and we were perpetrators, and that is not true.
Let's go to Ellen first for a response.
I certainly can't presume to speak about your own family and can only acknowledge how much distress you all must be in. What I can say is that, in general, false claims of child sexual abuse are demonstrably rare. There's a study by Dr. Judith Herman, who's a psychiatrist for 20 years, associated with Harvard Medical School, and what she has proven in that study is that only 6% of the claims made by survivors who are already adults are not able to be corroborated in some way, so that most claims not only do we think that they're true, but can actually be corroborated.
Mm-hmm. You know, this is walking away from human lives. People throw around statistics, 6%, 20%, 30%.
That's right.
The reality of the matter is the woman who just called in today has had her family destroyed, has seen her daughter deprived of contact with family members because some, quote, therapist It's not, by the way, stated that this is even a therapist. This may have been a counselor. This may have simply been someone who decided to hang out a shingle, who has perhaps even read Miss Bass's book and decided that this is a better way of making a living than selling cosmetics.
So what would you tell his mother to do then, Doctor?
Well, the first thing I think the mother should do is to join groups such as the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, which is branches. I think one of the things that's most important is for the parent to begin to heal themselves. Because unfortunately, when people are talking about events that happened 20 and 30 years ago, in our society, the parent may themselves wonder, did I do something wrong? I noticed that when Ms. Bass talked about abuse, she wasn't very specific as to what she meant by abuse. Was abuse using a loud word? Was abuse slapping a child or spanking a child?
No, I think
Let me go. If I may, I'd like to stay with this. We have a woman who's really imploring both of you for some help. What would you have her do? Ellen?
Hello?
Ellen, I'm asking, Arlene, I'm asking a question to see if we can get a response for you. Ellen Bass?
I just want to say Courage to Heal was given to my daughter, and that's where she came up with her memories. Because she read this Courage to Heal, and it said, if you believe that you were abused, then you truly were. How can somebody believe something like this?
I want to acknowledge how much pain that you're in, and as a mother myself, I can relate to a mother's pain. What I need to say, though, is that my book doesn't convince people that they were sexually abused.
If it doesn't, then why have 4,000 children read it and believe it?
I don't think that all 4,000 children weren't sexually abused.
May I just quickly, because we're going to go to a break. Arlene, I'd like to say something to you.
Yes, thank you.
May I ask you to consider the following?
Yes.
That you write a letter to your daughter and to other family members saying that at this point you are willing to hear what she has to say, to listen very clearly to
Sonya,
it,
I have.
and to try to relate what kinds of things may have occurred that would have brought her to this point so that you can be a family and go forward. Let me just say to you that in a number of court cases, there is an attempt, a new place of psychology and psychiatry to try to move people forward, knowing the pain and the isolation that comes from these kinds of things. We'll give you a last word, Doctor, but after we invite our audience in again, I promise. 212-643-0077. A large number of therapists and counselors say that they have frequently been able to help clients get into the dark recesses of memory to recollect childhood sex abuse, usually involving fathers and other male family members. To this shocking claim, there is now added another, in its own way just as shocking, that some of these therapists may be leading their clients to false memories and false accusations. That's the subject of a CNN special assignment report and the subject of my debate. More on Sonya Live as it continues.
U.S. manufacturing takes a big step backward. I'm Myron Kandel at the CNN Business News Desk in New York. The closely watched index of the National Association of Purchasing Managers fell sharply last month, down almost 4 points to 49.7. Any reading below 50 suggests the manufacturing sector is contracting. Also, construction spending fell 0.8% in March. Bad weather blamed for that, but February spending was revised upward to a much bigger gain than previously reported. The bond market focusing on the negative news. The Treasury's 30-year bellwether bond is up 20/32 of a point. The yield down to 6.87%. Those lower rates lifting the Dow Industrials out of an early 11-point slump. Right now the Dow is up 2 points at 34.29. Big board volume is heavy. The other key indexes are mixed. That's the latest in financial headlines. I'm Myron Kandel at the CNN Business News Desk in New York. And Sonya Live continues right after this.
Repressed memories of childhood sexual abuse, are they always real, or can false memories be created by a therapist? We'll go right back to phones to Shauna in California. Welcome.
Hi.
Yes.
I'm 25, and I didn't remember what happened to me until about last year. And it was through a friend of mine who's a therapist.
Uh-huh.
And if somebody thinks that they were abused when they were kids, it's true.
Well, let me ask you how you discovered that you were abused.
Just from talking. And he helped me remember.
Can you tell us how he helped you remember?
Excuse me?
How did he help you remember?
By talking to me about my past. He just talked to me and about things that had happened, and I'd remember.
Dr. Halpern?
It took a long time. It was 4 years.
Well, you know, it's very stylish and fashionable to see parents as villains in the piece nowadays.
My father was, though.
He may well have been. Obviously, I can't say whether or not he was. But the problem is that so much of what's brought up can be retrospectively projected into the past.
Well, do you know what you're saying is it makes people not even want to talk out and not to tell anybody about it?
Well, you know, ma'am, I can't really curb what I'm going to say because of some political game plan. All I can say is that the fact that someone is talking about something is in evidence. It's entirely possible that what happened to you did happen to you, but it's also possible that some 20 to 25 years after an event, people begin to look back at things, interpret things as abuse, when perhaps it was just your father kissing you on the forehead.
What about when you have nightmares about things that happen to you, and you don't want to tell anybody about it because you can't?
Well, one of the problems with...
when people don't believe you.
One of the problems with...
This is exactly the kind of response that survivors met up until about 20 years ago for sure, whenever they went to the mental health profession, and still over the last 20 years meet a great deal of the time. Well, neither I nor anyone else on this show, of course, can determine the authenticity of anybody's story in 2 minutes. However, it's very important that survivors who are listening to this show know that they have the right to trust themselves. Each survivor has the right and the ability to know and to name his or her own experience. That has to be the bottom line. It's not a political game plan. This is about the fact that we know now that approximately 1 in 3 women and a great many men were sexually abused as children.
Seems like a very high figure for a phenomenon just simply to surface in the last 4 years. And
actually, it didn't. In 1948,
Shauna is trying to get into this. Let's give her a chance, since she is the complainant.
Absolutely.
It is higher than that. It happens to so many women that are too ashamed to even say it because they were children. They're afraid. They don't want to have their parents and their family look down on them because they feel like it's their fault. And believe me, I know.
Shauna, I thank you for that call. I think you bring up a lot of very important points for us. We're going to go on to Lisa in Alabama now. Lisa?
Oh, my goodness.
Lisa, are you with us? If not, let's go to Ken in Virginia. Hi, Ken.
Hi.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, my wife and I are divorced, or we will be in the next few months. It all stems from a visit we made rather casually and innocently to a counselor, really to work on communication and goal setting in our family. He suggested we started coming separately, and after a few of the visits that she went to, she came home and started sharing with me some memories, foggy memories about not necessarily sexual abuse, but physical abuse from her father. He died 9 years ago, and I came home from a business trip a few months after this all started, and we talked about it, and she communicated to me that she wanted a divorce. It was it. The issues that came in the separation are always difficult, but they got vicious, and they got to be where there were serious personal attacks on me, my behavior, that were totally unsubstantiated. The only thing that I can figure that may help other people to understand this when I feel like perhaps I'm a victim of a victim is the ripple effect that it has in taking a life away where there's no way I can reconcile things that I had nothing to do with.
Right. Let me ask you to pause just for a moment as I take another call that may be helpful. Helen from Utah with us now. Hello, Helen.
Hello,
Yes.
Dr. Sonya. Thank you for letting me be on. I have a couple of questions for your guest, Ellen Bass.
Okay.
On page 154 in her book, I don't have it before me, but she states, if you lack any facts or knowledge about the abuse, just imagine it, and you can be able to continue on with the fact that you were a victim. I'd like her to explain that type of thinking. And also, again, I would like to ask her what her credentials are in psychology. And when she states there are only a few people, we are now in FMS 4,000 families and people calling by the hundreds daily because of the shows that are bringing these facts out. I also would like to ask her how much money she has made in writing such a book.
Ellen, before you respond, could you share your personal experience if you've had one in this area?
I've been accused of molesting my daughter at age 6 months, and someone in therapy helped her to put a face on the fact that I sexually abused my baby at age 6 months.
And you did not?
Of course I didn't.
Ellen?
And I believe that this book, Courage to Heal, has had a great impact on what has happened to me and thousands of other parents that we haven't heard from yet.
Ellen?
There's a lot to respond to in what you're saying. Just before I do, the gentleman who was cut off right before, I do want to say, just to acknowledge, I know that there are a lot of partners of survivors and ex-partners of survivors, husbands and wives, who have been severely affected by the abuse. And I just want to make that acknowledgement because, as you said very well, the ripple effects are great. I'm not quite sure which of the questions you asked me to start with. I am looking at page 154, and it does not say anything close to what you're describing.
Well, let's not be literal. Is there something of that nature in it? Or are you suggesting she's completely misinterpreting? She may have picked the wrong page. That's less important than the idea.
I don't, and no reputable therapist that I know of do. People who are reputable counselors do not encourage people to make up events from their past. The whole idea that counselors are there trying to concoct horrible histories for their clients is really inaccurate. And certainly therapists make a lot of mistakes, and there are many incompetent therapists just as there are incompetent people in every field.
Now, Helen, I'm curious to ask you, having heard that response, have you gone public with this? I mean, have you stepped out and identified yourself and your daughter so that you have taken a stand and said, I will not live with a false accusation and let it stand? I will come out and say who I am and that this did not occur?
I have, Sonia, and I have been on Tom Snyder's show about the 12th of April, and we had 300 calls. We had 60 calls of parents while we were on the air, and hundreds of calls every day after.
Would I have seen you? Who are you?
I'm Roseanne Barr's mother, and because of who I am, I have been in touch with people through FMS, and I have heard hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of families stand up and tell their stories, and every single one of them, their daughter was given the book, Courage to Heal.
Now, was your husband also accused?
Yes.
Is he with you now?
Accused. Pardon?
Is he with you now?
He's with me now also.
I would be happy if he would like to speak to his experience with us.
Yes, one moment. He'll pick up the phone. Here, dear.
On the other phone.
He's coming on to the other phone.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes.
We'll wait for just a moment because it's important for us to not deny the other people. Yes, please. Yes, go ahead. What's your experience in this, in terms of this accusation? Where do you think it came from?
It comes from my daughter and her husband, Tom Arnold.
But why do you think it comes?
Sonia, it would take me hours to explain to you what we have gone through and what we have put up with. And
what we've learned.
And what we've learned. We've been in this a year and a half. There's no way I can explain to you. We went on Tom Snyder 2-3 weeks ago. We've been on other shows here locally. I went to the state legislature in the state of Utah the other day and listened to one of these therapists get up on the floor of the legislature. She was the keynote speaker.
Is it possible that there was a
atrocious.
What she said was atrocious. But is it possible that there was a misinterpretation? Is it possible that something went on that, as it comes to the memory, is just highly distorted?
No.
Nothing?
Nothing.
Ellen Bass you said that it is important to allow the person who makes the accusation have herself and what she says, her belief, intact. What about people like this? Is it also important that they be permitted to have their belief intact?
Certainly everyone has the right to believe what they believe. What I think, and I'm not going to presume to pass judgment on any particular people calling in, because it would be ridiculous for me to think that I know anybody's situation in 2 minutes on television. However, we know that denial around the issue of child sexual abuse is as old as child sexual abuse itself. And as survivors have gone public about the abuse, the denial has gone public. There is just an enormous amount of motivation for someone who actually did commit the abuse to deny it, just like there would be motivation for someone who didn't commit the abuse to deny it. Abusers deny that they abused. This is something that we know.
There's a tremendous amount of motivation also for people to take vengeance on their family by making false accusations. I think that by their very nature, accusations such as the gentleman from Virginia described, his wife's father is 9 years dead, are unanswerable because of death, because of false memory, because of people getting a certain sense of attention and validation and a neat explanation for whatever is troubling them through all of this. And so you see families and people torn alive, burnt at the media stake because of the fact it's now fashionable to finally destroy the last good area in America, which is the American family.
To use words like fashionable in talking about the difficulty and shame and pain of survivors who share their experiences of child sexual abuse is certainly insulting.
Ma'am, the thing that I find very distressing is that you have walked away from the tremendous pain that may have been inflicted by false accusations from the people that have called in. You have bureaucratized them, reduced them to numbers. Well, it's true, it was only a few Jews that were being killed. These are people who are being sent to prison, facing legal battles that will destroy their life savings, any self-esteem within the community, and you walk away from these consequences of people promiscuously using your work.
Let's go back to Lisa in Alabama for just a moment. Lisa, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Your comments on what you've been hearing.
Yes, I have a copy of Ms. Bass's Courage to Heal. I was given it, a couple of years ago by my sister out in Santa Cruz, who accused my parents of molesting her. I also was given a copy of Fatal Flowers, which says that incest runs rampant in the South, which I disagree with. I have no real recollection of any of this happening. My point being that her therapist had told her that if it had in fact happened to her, that it would have happened to more or less everyone in the family as far as children go. This has just, it has done so much damage to my family. It's unbelievable. I stayed away from my parents for a year because I have children and was afraid of this fact.
Right.
And they are older senior citizens. We were raised in a very moral, rigid, more or less.
You know, it's interesting, as I listen to your background, I realize that there is so much more for all of us to discover. I appreciate the opinions that have been expressed here by everyone today. And my sense is there's a lot more study and research that needs to be done. Thank you all for joining us. And next.
Thank you very much.
He was taught to, you're welcome. He was taught to love everyone, but never to fall in love with anyone. And when he did, the scandal rocked the Catholic Church. When I come back, we'll meet a priest and the woman that he married. The Roman Catholic Church in our day has gotten a lot of publicity for things that it is against, like abortion and birth control. Some of its views on sexual matters have driven many people out of the Catholic Church, and Catholic priests are leaving in droves, often because the Pope and other church leaders will not allow priests to marry. Father Terence Sweeney is an ordained priest. In 1986, he married Pamela Shoup. Their marriage created a furor, and now they have collaborated on a book called What God Hath Joined. Father Sweeney, welcome. You obviously still consider yourself a priest. You are a priest, but you may not do any of the priestly rituals. Is that right?
There's a law that says a priest who marries is automatically suspended in virtue of his marriage, but I was suspended a year and a half before I married because I refused to suppress the American bishops' attitudes and the cardinals' attitudes worldwide on whether it's better for the church to have a married clergy. And because I refused to suppress that information, I was forced out of the Jesuit order and suspended as a priest.
Now, she is very beautiful.
Yes.
But there must have been other beautiful women also in your parish. That's quite a barrier to make a decision about stepping over.
Yes, it is.
And create a lot of conflict. How did you come to this conscious choice?
After many, many, many years of research and reflection, and after many, actually 2.5 years of soul searching regarding Pamela. Before I met her, I realized that over 100,000 priests in 25 years had left, 90% of whom are now married. I also realized that the historical origins for the laws of celibacy were both unchristian and unethical. So once I came to that conclusion, that intellectual clarity, that celibacy as a rule, as opposed to celibacy as a vow, was unchristlike, then I could, with freedom, explore my relationship with her.
It must have been difficult. Pamela, I'm interested in not only how you met, but how it really became romantic.
Well, it didn't become romantic for quite some time. We met in church. I was thinking of becoming a Catholic, and a mutual friend introduced us. And I realized very early on that there was the possibility of a much deeper bond for me with Terry than friendship. When I realized that, however, I knew that I had to pull back and not do anything. If there were ever to be any possibility of a future for us, it must come from him. I went through a real process of thinking I perhaps had offended God, that I was committing a mortal sin, that my soul was condemned to hell, all of the things that a woman who falls in love with a celibate priest feels. And gradually I realized that love was placed in my heart by God, and that's exactly where God wanted me to be. But I knew that if we were going to have a future, there had to be that same kind of spiritual, intellectual, and emotional compatibility and union in Terry's soul before he would be able to kind of give himself to me.
When you wear your garb, your clerical garb,
yes,
is that an affront to the Pope? I mean, if he were to walk into this room, would he say you really need to strip yourself of these vestments?
Most likely he would, but what I would have to say in response to that is people come to me. They know that I am married. They know that I was suspended for refusing to destroy research, but they still come to me and ask me to minister to them as a priest. And more than 75% of American Catholics would favor a married priesthood. Jesus himself chose married apostles as well as celibate apostles.
Do you celebrate Mass?
I do when I'm asked to. I cannot go into a church building and celebrate Mass. I cannot go into a church building and perform any of the sacraments. But outside of a church building, I do. And when people come, the supreme law of the church is the salvation of souls and the law of love. That law overrides every other law.
Having said that, the first 1,000 years of the church allowed married priests.
That's right.
Do you think, can you negotiate with the Catholic Church?
Well, if the Catholic Church is the people of God, absolutely. But if the Catholic Church is a hierarchy where the entire faithful is ruled by the power of one man's opinion, then you can't negotiate. I think Jesus founded a community of believers, not a hierarchy.
I thank you both for being with us today. It's a very, very interesting story.
Thank you for having us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I'll be right back. Thank you for joining me today. Tomorrow, would you believe that one of the hottest ideas in America today is spirituality? That every day many people like you are learning to meditate? Tomorrow, we're going to meet Marianne Williamson, Wayne Dyer, and Louise Hay. We'll find out why, as I continue to ask why things are the way they are. A look at our world from the inside out. Enjoy the rest of your day. Now for a look at what's ahead on Newsday, let's go to Cheryl Atkinson in Atlanta.
Sonia, thank you. Here's what's coming up. Could a couple of drinks a day be good for your heart? We'll tell you about new medical findings that may be great for the alcohol industry and moderate drinkers.
We're going to feel it.
And the good vibrations customers are getting at some restaurants. We'll tell what's changed about waiting for a table at your favorite eatery. Join Bobby Batista and me for Newsday next.